My name is Emily, and I'm a psychologist and regular guest on the Imperfects. I was proudly born and raised on Wurundjeri country and now live, work and raise my own children on the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people. I'm inspired by the strength and endurance of the world's oldest living culture. We at the Imperfects pay homage to traditions of story, and in particular its role in healing when we share and create space for stories on this podcast. Together with the Imperfects, I acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast was recorded, and extend my respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I acknowledge this land always was and always will be Aboriginal land.
This episode of The Imperfects features the discussion of sexual violence. If this is something you don't feel like you're ready to hear at the moment, then we suggest skipping the app, but please do come back when you're ready.
Well, shine my boots, governor, because we're in the Academy of Imperfection, where experts in their field share their wisdom on the subject of imperfection. Today, Chanel Contos tells us everything we need to know about sexual consent.
If you're taking it moment by moment with a person and vibing off each other's energy and having open communication, and you're being empathetic, you're being honest, you're being vulnerable, it's almost impossible to violate someone's consent.
So bookmark your Shakespeare and divert your full attention to an important Academy of Imperfection.
Welcome back to the Academy, one and all. It is lovely to be back here.
One and all.
Use that phrase.
Feels like you're practicing for the summer of cricket. Welcome back, one and all.
Yeah, I don't know why I said one and all, but I am very happy to be here because we've got a very special guest today. Someone who, well, the first time I heard about Chanel was when, it was a few months ago now. Chanel Contos is our guest. I got an email from Chanel's publisher. Actually, just thinking, is this name going to be a problem for you, Josh? The name Chanel?
Yes, it is.
Why is it a problem?
There's a friend of ours, and she's a new friend of ours, but she's a new friend to me.
Oh, yeah.
And her name's Chanel, but I cannot, there's like a wire wrong in my brain where I keep calling her Chantal.
Yeah, it's a thing.
Yeah.
I respond to both, so don't worry.
She said the same thing.
Yeah.
She's like, I'm pretty sure my best friends still call me Chantal.
I just don't really get it. There's just no T in there, but people just put it in all the time.
I don't know what it is, but the more I questioned it, the more I seem to get it wrong. And
Okay.
I introduced her to like 3 people the other day as Chantal.
Yeah.
She's so used to it that she said she didn't even notice. Or she's being kind. Could be the latter.
I think she would definitely notice. I think she's being kind. But
She does seem like
you can just avoid saying my name. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. Okay.
It's irrelevant.
I think it's quite relevant to this part of the show, at least an introduction. But
Yeah. I've got the that's how you can remember.
Oh, yeah, Chanel earring. Yeah, that's very...
Oh, yeah.
Very helpful for acquaintances.
It's the
It
same
is.
spelling as Chanel,
exactly.
isn't it?
Yeah.
So if I...
Coco.
I'll just look at your ear.
My jeans
before.
actually also say Chanel today.
Wow.
You couldn't be making it easy.
I couldn't make it any
Does
easier.
any of your clothing have a T on it anyway?
No,
Okay, then we're
absolutely nowhere.
My friend's name is Target. So it's sort of easier to remember their name. And it's cheaper for them to shop too.
So I first heard about Chanel a few months ago. I got an email from Chanel's publisher saying she'd just written a book called Consent Laid Bare, and asked if I would be interested in giving a testimonial to it. And I said, yeah. And they sort of gave like an overview of what it's about. And I said, definitely send it through. And I think I gave you this feedback directly. I definitely told them, but I read a part of it and then I stopped reading it. And I was so moved by it that I nominated you for Australian of the Year. And I've never nominated anyone for Australian of the Year before. I had to work out how to do it. And it actually took a bit of time, but...
What a hero. Guess who I'm nominating this year? Hugh Van Goldberg, for the effort he took to nominate Chanel.
I'll be voting for you, Hugh.
No, seriously, great job,
That
mate.
is very, very kind of you.
thanks, guys.
Extremely
Noble
kind.
effort.
So I just want to be quicker, that's all.
All the forms and stuff. I get it.
But what I didn't say in the correspondence I had with your publisher, I think I tried to play it a bit cool, and I said, yeah, I read quite a few chapters, and after 4 or 5 chapters, I was like, that's it. It was actually much quicker than that. And what I'd like to do now is just share with the listeners how quickly I actually stopped and nominated you. So I'm going to read, I hope this isn't weird, I'm going to read the start of your book.
No, it's so
to you.
nice. It's, very sweet.
Okay,
Thank
so
you.
the book starts like this. You're 12 years old and out for a run. A block away from your home, you get catcalled by a grown man, so you stop exercising in public. You're 13 at your first party when someone grabs your ass and another boy does, and then another. You start counting how many do and equate it with how hot you look that night. You're 14 and everyone is gathered around to look at the most recently leaked nude from the girl at the school down the road. You're 15 and you see a boy fingering a semi-unconscious girl on the sofa. The social code is to turn your head away to give them privacy, so you do. But of course, everyone still talks about how embarrassing it was for the girl to be so drunk. You're 16 and you wake up to your boyfriend having sex with you. You're shocked, so you just lie there. You find it hard to sleep for weeks after. You're 18 and your manager at work makes comments about your outfit and touches your back every time he walks past you. You feel icky, but you need the money and there's no point making a fuss. You're 20 and someone starts choking you in bed. You can barely breathe, but the fear of him telling people you're a prude makes you go along with it. You're 22 and you have a lovely date with a guy you've been crushing on for ages, but you're actually crushed when you realise he took off the condom when you weren't looking. You're 25 and a stranger airdrops you an unsolicited dick pic when you're on the bus home. You look around not knowing which man just violated you, so you get off the bus 4 stops early. It takes an extra 15 minutes to walk along the well-lit route, but you don't want a repeat of that time someone followed you home. You're 35 and your husband makes jokes about you being his ball and chain and complains to his friends that he doesn't get it enough, so you have sex with him out of obligation. You speak to older women and you realise it never ends. So that's actually when I stopped and nominated you.
It was very early on.
So that's why I was like, I come across too keen to publish it. But
very nice. Thank you so much.
But I so much happened to me in that moment of you. I've like literally at that point of the book, I don't think I've ever been so emotionally engaged with what was to come for so many reasons. But it was at that point that I realised what you are taking on. Do you mind me asking how old you are?
I'm 25.
25. Age 25, taking this. I mean, you have been doing it for a while though, fighting this fight. And I just couldn't believe, the courage might be the right word, but just the strength to go, I'm taking this on because it's not right. And that's when I stopped and went to the very lengthy process of nominating Australia. So
thank you. That's very, yeah. It's actually funny because that is the last thing I wrote in this book.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
I couldn't figure out how to introduce it. I couldn't figure out what introduction to give. And my publisher kept saying, some sort of like catchy story. And I was thinking about all these specific times, experiences in my youth or nights out or things I saw or was a part of that could have kind of made that hook and was very kind of like interesting. And then I was like, that doesn't reflect the situation. Like, just because something happened to me and my friends on one Saturday night is not the problem. And then landed on that idea that I think, unfortunately, every woman in Australia could probably relate to in some way.
Yeah, and I'm going to say something a bit weird here, but I think also every man in Australia can probably relate to as well. I have to be really honest with you. I feel I've been quite nervous about this interview today, and I don't usually get nervous about interviews, but I am nervous about this one today because I feel like I've grown up, I went to private school and I have played sporting clubs my entire life. And the whole time reading this, I'm just thinking, shit, I've been a part of this. I've absolutely been a part of this. And it just made me nervous reading it going, yeah, I'm a part of it. And so I feel like I just want to say that to you before we even have this conversation today, because I do feel, not obviously extreme end, but I've laughed at stuff. I've been, you talk about how for men, right near the end, you talk about toxic masculinity and how social currency for men is sexual conquest, and men will tell stories and laugh about it. And I've been a part of that. Like, I just feel like I just need to say that. I've listened to those stories. I never once said, hey, that's not fair to that person. And like, I'm 43 and I just feel like, yeah, I'm very aware of the culture. I've watched the culture from very closely for a long time, and I love that you are taking this on.
Thank you, and I appreciate you saying that because I am very well aware that almost every single person in Australia has been a part of this culture in some way, shape, or form, the world even. And I do really appreciate it when people are willing to be reflective of it, and especially men in that way, because I think it's a really great way to lead by example to show that you can someone who's younger who might be listening, who hears those jokes now, who still has the opportunity to interrupt in that way and change the narrative. And I think about it all the time as well. Like, I also say this in the book, but I've completely been, I've upheld rape culture in different ways and shapes throughout my life. I used to call people sluts all the time and not have any idea what that word meant or the gravity of it. It used to be very common to gossip about situations that, in hindsight were girls' experiences of sexual violence or sexual assault. Just kind of like, jokes to friends being like, oh, you should do this with him. Like, you should do that. Like, come on, don't be frigid. Like, all of these sort of things. They were never meant with malice, but they were what was normal. And that is what is still normal, unfortunately. And I'm, very quick to own up that I've also been a massive part of that.
It's I feel like during the Me Too movement, a lot of us, well, I'd say particularly men, sort of learnt a lot about how prevalent this is in everyday life with everyone. I just remember, I can't remember what the exact example was, but it's something like this. I remember, in that time, listening to a podcast or reading an article and saying to, I think I said to Jam, or it was something like this. Jam's my girlfriend. I was like, do you know, a lot of women, even if you're walking down the street, that if I'm as a man, if I'm just walking behind you, that women actually just get scared just because I'm walking. Do you know that? And she's like, yeah, obviously. I was telling her as if
mansplaining.
It was mansplaining, and she was like,
mansplaining, male bias.
That's the problem.
How did that go down?
She was understanding, empathetic, but I think the positive of all that was it gave men an excuse to. It wasn't hard to find information like that at that time, and I think this book is exactly that. And I think that what I'm really hoping is that the men who listen to this podcast, I'm hoping they're still listening. I'm hoping they're not scared off by this episode. I'm hoping that. Because I felt the same as Hugh. I haven't been as big a part of sporting culture as you have, but definitely I'm a part of it. I'm definitely seeing things, and even thinking about doing this episode today. I was just thinking before, what is an example that what is an anecdote, a story that I can tell of when I've actually seen something happen. Mm-hmm. And I was like, well, there's this one thing that I remember seeing, and I was like, oh, but if I tell that story, that guy will know I'm talking about him, and my immediate friendship group will know that I'm talking about him, even if I don't mention any names. And so I was like, well, I don't think I can, and that in itself is obviously a massive part of the problem.
Yeah,
that we're avoiding. Naming people, or not even naming, but at least
any form of accountability.
Any form of accountability, because I'm worried, because I'm a prick. I'm worried about the identity, the reputation of my friend. Not even thinking about
to paint something that's already been done just in a different light.
Yeah,
I had a very similar situation that I'm not going to delve into now for the exact same reason you just said. But it was actually when I was writing my dissertation, I wanted to use an example of something, and I was basically decided not to for various reasons. But in that process, someone sent me a quote that is actually the very beginning of the book. And the quote is, be ruthless with systems and kind with people.
I love that. I love that quote.
And I think that's kind of the best way we can approach the situation, because there is a lot of shame around this topic. There should be shame in an extent. It is shameful to have done these things. But how can we make that open enough that people can sit in that shame and learn from it, rather than just completely repelling it and refusing to go forward? And I think the best way to do that is to talk about these systems, talk about rape culture, talk about patriarchy, talk about what we see in pop culture, have these high level, very critical ideas of the structures around us, the systems around us that have enabled this. But then when we're on an individual personal level, being as kind and compassionate and realistic about the situation as we can be.
Mm-hmm. There's this great bit. I'd like to read a bit as well. If
Yeah,
that's all right.
please. We're in an audiobook now. I should have got you guys. It would have saved me some time.
But before I do, I wonder whether it would be helpful. I'd certainly like to hear you talk about it, but like a definition of rape culture. And also, while you're doing definitions, like a definition of consent as well. I think would be, it may seem obvious to people, but I think it would be good to hear it from you.
So I think rape culture sounds like a paradox to people because the culture is something that we're supposed to, that's what we all agree with, what we like, what we engage with, and what we contribute to. And then obviously rape is something that we supposedly in our society understand to be a bad thing. But a rape culture describes a sociological setting where sexual harassment, sexual assault, and sexual violence are normalized and pervasive due to society's attitudes about gender and sexuality. And the key word there, I think, is normalize, the fact that we create a system in which acts that count as sexual assault can go unnoticed. And, that can happen through things like consistently seeing in movies girls being, unbelievably drunk and waking up and not remember anything, and that actually being an act of sexual violence, but that being completely normalized to us in the way we ingest that. And then consent, it's such a hard one. I hate defining consent because...
Just before you do consent though, I feel like when you explain what rape culture is, I think before you'd have said that, I reckon most people would think, oh, I'm not in a rape culture. But hearing you say what a rape culture is like, oh yeah, we're all in
That's
different
our
parts.
culture.
That's
Yeah,
our
yeah.
culture. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, and I mean, again, there's like attitude, when I'm talking about attitudes and expectations about gender and sexuality, I'm talking about these ideas that, like men gain something from sex and women lose something and they should kind of avoid it, and that it's like this idea of sex as an act of like hoodwinking a woman, like these sort of things, and like the very strict centered focus on male sexual entitlement, especially seen in pornography and things like that. And again, all kind of movies, all TV shows or rom-coms, whatever. And then the complete disregard for female sexuality and like so few conversations or acknowledgement of female pleasure and desire and things like that. And so even those just kind of like simple things you realize are all around us at all times. And rape culture isn't just the act of rape, it's the fact that sexual violence becomes normalized. And then to consent. I strangely struggle to define the word consent because I think about it too much. But legally, consent is freely giving permission to do something. I have questions around this word of freely, which is what my book goes into in quite a bit of depth around kind of like how much is our own choice and how much is different forces impacting these sort of things. But in the most simple sense of the word, and we're talking about, I guess, in a sexual context, when people like say that they're confused about consent or how to like, what agreement means, because there are lots of complexities and layers to that. My message is always, if you're acting with empathy in these situations, you can never violate someone's consent. If you're focusing on their experience and their sexual pleasure in an interaction and your relationship with them and the way you're engaging with them, there's just like absolutely no way you're going to accidentally perpetrate sexual violence against them. But a disregard for that person as a human, as a sexual partner, in those ways is where consent can very easily be breached unknowingly.
It really, and I don't say this to sound like to be a joke or anything, but like to be a generous lover is really a big part of it. I think. I mean, it's sort of like, I think whenever I've heard like generous lover, it's sort of said in like a funny context, as in like a, I don't know, like some
funny
sort of
words together.
comedic thing.
Well, I think it's funny that I've only ever heard the word generous lover apply to men, because it's almost as if like a man providing an orgasm for a woman is seen as an anomaly
generous.
and generous,
Yes.
but like it's expected that a woman would provide an orgasm for a man.
Yep.
Women are never called generous lovers, and like I think like if you look at the orgasm gap, men orgasm from sex with women a lot of the time. Women do not orgasm from sex with men a lot of the time.
So true.
rape culture, there you go. Just another way our words are used to kind of like the most, like there's nothing malicious about that. It's just a thing. It's, a joke, generous lover, but what does that imply and suggest when you like really peel back those layers of how it's affecting subconscious?
It's so true. Like thinking about like the origins of where these words and phrases come from are things that are just sort of like ingrained in our heads as, in my mind, my default thought is like generous love is a good thing. Good to be generous. Like, but you're so
it's like when
right.
someone gets called a good dad for like picking up the kids from school. Or like when it's like, oh, I'm babysitting tonight. It's like, no, they're your own children.
Yeah. I was joking with Penny about that. Yeah. I also think there's something really empowering in the way you phrase it with empathy, that the goal here isn't just to, like, obviously if you go in with that framework, then the bare minimum is that you reduce sexual assault and rape, but you can actually turn sex into what it should be, which is an enriching and beautiful thing in your life, in people's lives. If their focus, I just think if you reframe it through that thing of empathy and thinking about the other person the whole time, suddenly you're on a path to getting a lot out of, sex enriching your life and enriching relationships, which sounds like a pretty optimistic and hopeful and wonderful place to be.
100%. I think, a lot of the work I do does revolve around trying to prevent sexual assault. But really, if we all strive towards a society where healthy intimacy was the norm, then sexual assault would become something that would become an anomaly in that situation. Therefore, rape culture couldn't exist because those acts couldn't go by unrecognized and deemed as normal and socially acceptable. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think we do really need to strive towards that idea of healthy intimacy, which involves a lot more than just consent education, for sure.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, thank you for that, Chanel. I'm going to read this. You'd spoken already in the book about an incident where you'd learnt about what sexual assault is, what indecent assault is, and you realised that you and your friends at school had realised that, we are all victims of this, and you talked about the boys, So this is just a passage that just came after that. When I found out that the guy who sexually assaulted me had also sexually assaulted another girl, my first thought was, if I had known what consent was, I could have reported him and stopped him from doing the same thing to her. Now I think, if he had known what consent was, maybe he would have never done it to me or anyone else. And that, I feel like that perspective shift, that was very powerful, and that spoke to me really well. And I feel like that is I feel like that will speak to men and boys in a really powerful way, because what is so incredible, I think one of the things you say in the book is the importance of empathy for young boys. I think a lot of boys and men of all ages, are terrified of being judged as they in a lot of cases they should be. But I think there's a lot of boys particularly who have just not been given the education that they need, which is exactly what you're doing now, which is so incredible. But if the boys haven't been taught from a young age what's right and wrong in regards to consent, then how can they be expected to do the right thing? I think that shift from but if I knew, as if it's like the women's responsibility, that's the wrong way to look at it. It's obviously the men's responsibility, and then to give them the responsibility, they need the education. Incredible.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it was definitely an important switch in my mind about understanding how this sort of sexual violence is perpetrated and how it can be prevented. I have a very strong theory that the vast majority of sexual violence in Australia is perpetrated out of a lack of education, out of entitlement, out of ignorance, either a disregard for or a lack of understanding of consent. And there's also ample studies to back this up. And that intervening by explicitly giving this sort of information can actually prevent a lot of these crimes, because a lot of the sexual violence being spoken about in this book is related to kind of teen on teen perpetrated sexual assault. And the most common demographic in Australia to perpetrate rape is a 15 to 19-year-old male. which is like a really scary statistic because when you look at that, a lot of those men are children, which means that we're talking about child sexual abuse, but we're also talking about children perpetrating this sort of abuse. And where do you draw that line in terms of saying, you know, you've done this, or saying this culture has enabled that to become something that is normal for you to do, and to not only go sometimes without account, but also with celebration. As you said, Hugh, this idea of sexual conquest being like a social currency, the book goes into that. And that was just so prominent in my whole youth amongst guys, explicitly or non-explicit, like implicitly. And it feels as though that sort of stuff can very easily be changed because there's nothing inherent in these young boys or men that makes them want to perpetrate crime. They don't want to hurt someone. They just haven't been taught how to engage in this, you know, idea of sex that a lot of young adults want in any sort of healthy way.
In your experience in the research and writing the book, and in all the activism you're doing, how much with boys, teenagers, like that is a time where, especially in my experience, that is a time where I am terrified of sex. Like, you know, like boys, I think at that age are so, certainly not all, but my guess would be a lot more than we think. Boys are scared of sex to the extent where it's like, you don't want to embarrass yourself. You don't want to do the wrong thing. You want to, you know, you don't want word to get around that you're bad at it. And I don't know, like, does that have an impact, do you think, on how men or boys behave?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I feel like that's kind of something that I hear from like older men a lot, being like, oh my God, in my days, like we were terrified of even speaking to a girl, like we would never. And it's interesting because it's definitely not the case that these sort of things didn't happen in that generation. I feel as though I'm going to like go back a little bit. I'm hopefully get to an answer eventually. It's almost as if a lot of the things that men are scared of like messing up in sex, that they're scared that like rumors are going to go around about them, all these things, and then being bad at it is defined not by whether they're abiding by consent or not, but more things like how long are they lasting? Are they like, you know, it's interesting. I feel like making women orgasm can kind of go like one or two ways. Either men like really don't care, or it's something that they like value as part of like their again, if they're going to be like bragging about it,
like a badge or something.
Exactly, that sort of thing. And or like, you know, maybe being worried that they're not going to like get hard or stay hard or like any of those sorts of things. But I've never heard in any sort of narrative, and when I say heard, I also mean what I've seen in like movies and like American teen high school movies or like rom-coms, like things that have very much shaped the culture of young Australians. I've never heard them ever be worried about like ensuring that a woman is like having a good time, or that the act is consensual, or like checking in about those things. So
true.
It's much more like, oh my God, am I going to put the condom on quickly? Or like, am I going to not be able to like not open the wrapper?
And the only times that I can think of, particularly in that film example, times where it's almost like, it's like comedic in the sense that the guy's trying to like put on this perfect night as if it's like this special occasion that he'll treat her really well. It's like, no, I've got to put on a good show and I've got to make sure I make a good impression. Not as a default, but as like a special treat.
Yeah.
And that is, I feel like that is, it's you're so right. It's the not the default that you're taught.
Yeah. And I also think you're kind of taught in those situations in terms of like, I can imagine if I was a teenage boy, like it would be like scary and confronting to go into that situation because how much value society puts on how you're going to perform in that situation. And when I say society, I mean kind of like your immediate peers and like your mutual friends or whatever. And I think what really carries through into that situation is like we very much see an ideal man as someone who's very confident and opportunistic and like, you know, a go-getter. And I think that doesn't relay well with our narratives of consent in the world. Almost, I think people think that like consent almost sounds like doubt, to like ask questions about things rather than feeling confident towards them.
Yeah, that makes sense.
One of the things you wrote one of the things you reported in the book was that, and this, I couldn't believe this, but the more I read the book, the more I understood it. But you say that, well, in the book it says that 1 in 5 women have experienced rape. And then when you actually broke down what different like rapists look like, then I started to understand a bit more how that's possible. And you talked about one of the categories, but one of the types of rapists being entitled opportunist. Can you sort of talk about that?
Yeah, so...
Because I feel like that is when you talk about 15 to 19-year-olds.
Yeah.
I feel like that is probably the vast majority of them would be in that category.
In my opinion, almost all of like rapists in Australia are in that category,
Okay.
in my opinion.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, obviously sexual violence occurs at a very large scale and there's different types of it. But yeah, just to summarize really quickly, I'll also just touch on the other 3.
Yeah.
Basically, I found this thing that really changed my perception of a lot of the work I do on my thoughts, and it was a typology of different rapists, and there's like actually quite a lot of literature that exists in this space, but it sits in like forensic psychiatry, whereas I think it's very valuable if you take a gender lens to it and look at violence prevention. And it basically splits rapists. They obviously aren't always going to fit in only one category, and everyone's different. It's just a framework. But the first 3 types of rapists are known as like sadistic, angry, or compensatory. And these 3 types of rapists very much fit the kind of stereotype of what we think about when we think about a rapist. Like they probably going to be basically like quite creepy dudes. Like sadistic rapists are very likely to murder their victim as well. Angry rapists sometimes accidentally murder their victims out of rage. And compensatory rapists wouldn't have the traditional social skills to kind of like meet someone at a party or like create an organic relationship with someone like that. All 3 of those types of rapists have almost always experienced abuse themselves, whether sexual or physical. And it's kind of like a cycle of abuse continuing through, generational trauma. And there's actual like reasons that they want to hurt other people. The type of rapist that is most interesting to me and that like pretty much all the work I do revolves around, it's known as an opportunistic rapist, but I call it entitled opportunist because I think entitlement is key to understanding why this type of rapist perpetrates sexual violence. Things about entitled opportunists are they are completely normal, if not like liked in all other aspects of life. They are... Again, these traits that are valued in men, they're opportunistic, they're go-getters, they don't take no for an answer. They almost always start when they are teenagers, and no intergenerational trauma needs to be addressed to prevent these types of rapists. If they are held accountable for their actions, they are very unlikely to repeat offend. And if they, with adequate consent education, they're unlikely to offend in the first place. Because essentially with an entitled opportunist, the entitlement to another person's body outweighs the empathy that they have towards that person, which is what results in sexual violence. And entitled opportunists almost always use sexual coercion as their avenue for sexual assault.
Sorry, I think
I'll define that. Yeah.
I was going to say, what does that sound like or what does that look like? Yeah.
So sexual coercion is defined by being threatened, pressured, tricked, blackmailed in a non-physical way. So being pressured into sex, usually verbally. And in teen years, it sounds like, and when I say this, people are probably going to think like, oh shit. But, it sounds like, I'll break up with you if you don't do this for me. You're giving me blue balls you have to finish. I'm going to send that photo you sent me last week to someone else unless you give me head. All of these different things that literally are just a sentence that makes someone feel as though they don't have an option other than to engage in that act. And that is a form of sexual assault. And I think the idea that sexual assault can be done without physical force and like without any form of explicit violence is quite like jarring to people. And the thing that I found so interesting about the entitled opportunist is that this understanding of rapists could only be conducted on convicted rapists in prison. But our current criminal system only prosecutes 1.5% of rapists in Australia, which means that we've essentially decriminalised rape in Australia. And when you look at that and you think about being a victim of an entitled opportunist is the exact type of person who would be least likely to report, least likely to be believed, least likely for the case to go to court, and then least likely to get a guilty conviction. Whereas those other three types of rapists, if someone, spikes you, if someone kidnaps you, if someone like jumps at you at the middle of the street, the criminal system is likely to take those people much more seriously. So when you kind of look at that and know that they still make up the vast majority of rapists in prison, and kind of like take a step back, even to the point of a lot of victims of this type of rape wouldn't even know that that counts as sexual assault. In my mind, that's like the most important type of person to like try to prevent in Australia. And the point is that anyone can become one of these people if their entitlement outweighs their empathy.
There's so many things in that which we could discuss. I think the one that I naturally gravitate towards, just being in education as well, is that I feel like all those men, if they knew, when they were boys, if they were taught at a young age that that's sexual assault, it just wouldn't happen.
That's what I think too. That's why I advocate for consent education. And that's why I have a very, arguably too optimistic, some people may say, but that is what I think of the world and what I think can change.
I couldn't agree with you more. I disagree wholeheartedly. That's too optimistic. That's just real. Like, I just feel like so many boys in that situation, when I look back on going through school or whatever, it's like it's to fit in. Like, it's boys, they just want to they want to fit in and be popular and be cool, and that is the culture laughs at that stuff, or it rewards it, or it's like social currency. But if from a really young age it was like, no, that's sexual assault.
Because we understand that to be a crime, right? We know that's like a bad thing. We don't understand. It's the same as kind of like a cat call at the bus stop. It's like, oh, it's just a cat call. It's sexual harassment. And when you like attach that loaded word to it, it kind of makes it feel a lot more real. But yeah, it was a few years ago when me and a friend were kind of like strategizing about like the consent campaign and like what we needed to do and blah, blah, blah. We were basically like, we need to make consent cool, because teenagers like go after what is cool. It's kind of like, that's this way that social interactions occur at that age is like quite unique, different to other parts of life. And right now, and when I was at school for sure, the status quo was very much that what made you cool is kind of like one-upping each other and like who can be more rebellious. And like, because I think there is an inherent understanding that these things are wrong or not okay. I just don't think people understand how wrong. And it's like, well, how can we bring consent to be something that like teenagers aspire to? A big aspect of that is like male role models in the space, or, whether it's at the school, on a public stage, in the home.
How you just described that type of rapist and the type of person that is, I feel like when we grew up, like when I was in school, and I think of a rapist, even that word now is so, it feels like a word that I can't say around in some, like it even feels jarring to say it on this podcast, even though it's exactly what we're talking, it's the topic of the day. And I think a big part of that is because when I was growing up, and even now to a certain degree, whenever you see a film or a TV show and there is a storyline about a rapist, they're always a villainous character who is not to be trusted in, they're sort of painted to be the kind of outcast type of character. And I think from what you're saying is like often with teenage boys, it's not the outcasts. It's the for want of a better example, the quarterback. And we do see that, I think, more and more, where it's like the guy you think is the good guy in the show turns out to be the quote unquote bad guy. But often it isn't black and white like that. Often I think in reality, and I think what would help people understand is that like anyone, choose my words right here, but it's like so many men, boys, are obviously doing the wrong thing, and they don't realize it's the wrong thing because they're not being shown what the right thing is and how wrong it is. And they think like, well, I'm not the weird outcast. I'm popular and I'm nice to people. So it's like, I guess that's the
behavior
entitlement.
Socially acceptable.
Yeah. But yeah, maybe that's right, is to see to see cool examples of consent in film and television somehow.
Well, interesting that you brought this up about the idea of kind of like a creepy rapist being what we see on TV, because that's also what I used to think until I guess, got a bit more privy to all of this stuff and then started rewatching old movies. Like, I don't know, I can't remember the exact scenes, but shows like American Pie, like
Yes.
How I Met Your Mother, like we are consistently seeing acts of sexual assault occur on TV. They're just being celebrated in those moments. Or laughed off, or not, like, I mean, being like, oh, it's so embarrassing, like she woke up and she had sex with that guy and she doesn't remember it. Like, classic plot of any teen movie sort of thing. That's sexual assault. And it's being normalized through media and all these sorts of things. So when you actually look back on it, some things age so badly, and I think that's really one of them. And I was watching Sex Education on the weekend. And
Which is a TV show, Sex Education.
Yeah, a TV show. And they have scenes of like very explicit consent being shown and like acknowledging kind of all of these things. And that made me very hopeful, because I would have never, ever, 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 ever seen a single thing like that growing up with the kind of like, 2000s era of movies. It's
gotta like get into like the Marvel films though. Like it's got to get into the things that the guys are watching.
I know.
Because it makes sense that it's in the storyline of Sex Education.
Yeah.
and it's so good, and it's hopeful. It's so nice. But
who would you be choosing? Who's the coolest person you can think of?
You got to get a Hemsworth or something. You got to get.
I think he's too old.
Oh yeah.
Is he?
Okay.
I don't know. I don't know who teenagers look up to. I'm guessing a Hemsworth is too old.
I got asked yesterday if you could have anyone in the world be ambassador for consent, who would it be? And I said Messi.
Oh yeah.
Is that his name?
Messi.
Yeah. Oh, he's pretty old.
Yeah, well, I mean, but boys absolutely idolize him.
Yeah,
I know that enough.
Yeah. I was just thinking on the education point, I think I'm trying like really hard to remember what it was like being a teenage boy in this conversation, like really casting my mind back. Being a teenager for boys, girls, for anyone is so confusing and like kind of terrifying. And I feel like there's the confusion and everything that's going on and a lack of understanding of so much. And then the narrative of sexual conquest is like a really simple idea for a teenage boy to grasp onto, as this will make the problems go away of how confusing this is. And I feel like a lot of the behaviour, and I'm not an expert in this at all, but I'm just trying to cast my mind back to, being a teenager myself and seeing the way, and all the stories we've been talking about, that it's a simple solution to a complex problem for a boy to just, if I can just do that and I sort of close my eyes and go for it sort of thing, that will solve the immediate problem of all the other shit I'm feeling at the moment as a teenage boy, that confusion, the stress, the angst, the whatever, trampling on other people in the process in doing it. But that's why I using that framework to justify what you were saying before about how important education is and how getting in earlier to try and, because like sex is so confusing. I think it's still confusing as a person in my mid-30s.
Well, the main form of sex education in Australia is pornography.
Yeah, well,
so that's
extremely
the other confusing.
Yeah, so you've got confused boys and who are desperate for affirmation, and there's a lot of porn and not a lot of really good education out there on sexual consent and sex in general. It kind of just seems like a recipe for disaster, and it's like, as if there wouldn't be a problem if that's the
current state of it.
Current state of affairs, yeah.
I've never been a teenage boy, obviously, except the way I imagine it is that there's kind of social pressures coming in from the outside. You always hear things like when we were at school, they would like pay out the boys who were frigid, who like, they call them virgins. Like they'd be like all these sort of negative things, and then again, praise for these sort of acts. So that pressure is coming from the outside. And then that boy relieves that pressure often like to another young woman. And that's kind of like how I imagine it. And like what you said, like it's like this is a solution to this much wider problem. But it's obviously not a solution. It's obviously a very violent act, but it's not understood as that. Especially when, again, pornography is the main form of sex education.
Yeah, I just, it's so funny how this conversation has like popped in my head. This is 20 years ago, but I'm trying to use language that's not inflaming the problem here, but I was just a late developer, I guess. Like I didn't really, all my other friends were having a lot more sexual interactions than I was as a teenager. And I remember sort of being upset and frustrated by that, but I was also kind of tentative and nervous, and there was a few other factors here that made me just really confused and found it all very complicated. I remember having a chat with a girl who said, you need to be more like, and name this person who was kind of known as being pretty inappropriate and pretty bad, like very much the archetypal entitled person you were talking, entitled opportunist you were talking about before. And I remember it shocked me at the time that was the path offered to me. It was like, that's the way you get there. That's the way you experience more sexual activity. And that's always stuck with me, that was the advice I was given by a fellow teen.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and I think that most teens would kind of think that inherently, because that's, again, what's kind of been taught to us. All the cool guys we've seen in movies, like all these things have been doing those acts. And I think that's also another really good example of how girls and women, although disproportionately affected by rape culture, also uphold it, often like unknowingly and in these ways. Like,
well, as you said before, if they're not aware that sorry to cut you off there. Did you want to keep going?
You go.
Okay. Just because it was really struck me out of what you were talking about before with the entitled opportunist, that there's a structure built where 99% of them are let off. Then therefore, most people living in that environment must rationalise it to themselves that what's happening is okay.
Which I think is what happens a lot. I also think that's kind of why the Teachers' Consent campaign like really struck a chord, because it highlighted these extremely like quote unquote like mundane experiences and gave them this label. Because I think that like that 1 in 5 statistic, Hugh, that you were shocked by, I call absolute bullshit on it. I think it is so much higher. I think that we haven't. First of all, it's 1 in 5 since the age of 15. So me, for example, wouldn't count in that statistic because I was 13.
Yeah.
And then second of all, I think that we don't have enough education about what constitutes sexual violence to be able to adequately measure it, because I think people, as you said, like see the word rape and think, no, like that doesn't make sense. That's not me. And yeah, I think it has, like, I guess the key point here is that this behavior has been completely normalized.
I really want to talk about my own personal experience in some way. So I was in a long-term relationship from when I was 19 or 20 to like when I was 30. And in my teen years, I was not a promiscuous boy at all. You know, I was, as I explained before, like just scared of this world. Then when I was single for the first time in my adult life, you know, when I was like 30 essentially, I was all of a sudden faced with the reality of having to enter the dating world and to meet women. And that was like, I wasn't necessarily that worried about the meeting or the talking, but I had this real fear of like essentially hooking up with people that I didn't know. Like the idea of a one night stand, I really had never done before because I'd been in these long-term relationships and it wasn't really a part of my teen years. I'm now realising Mum and Dad listen to this podcast. This is sort of strange.
Hey, Mum, hey, Dad. Don't worry, I listen to everyone.
Yeah. Okay. So, but I'm just sort of trying to, in that time when I'm out there, and I would, as a way to make it easier, I would get drunk. I'd go out and I don't, like, I'm not leading to anything. Like I didn't do anything that would put me in a category that you described. And I'm comfortable with that. But I do remember the fear I had, and because I had all this fear about being in a situation that I didn't know what to do, and the fear of being laughed at or being, not good enough, and assuming that the women that I was meeting had all this experience and then would judge me if I didn't meet a certain expectation or I didn't meet a standard. Like, I didn't even know what I was thinking. I was just like thinking that, when it's that feeling of like first day of school where you're like, I don't belong here. Like this, I'm going to be found out. I'm going to be teased. But I think the point of me saying this is within that fear, my worst fear, ironically, was for them to think I was scared. My fear was that the few women that I had the courage to meet and, have a one night stand with, my great fear was that they would realize that I didn't know what I was doing and that I was like scared and that I wasn't experienced and that and so I think to make up for that, I pretended like I was this Don Juan, want of a better term, this experienced sexual god, which is nor the case, never was. But I can sort of see how a certain person that could go to a certain degree that would be like wanting to be impressive in the bedroom could lead to some bad places. But what I realize now, looking back on it, and if I was to have my time again, is, and we talk about this all the time in this podcast, but I think what would actually be, and this is going to sound really like cliched, but I actually do believe what would be the sexiest thing to do is to be completely vulnerable and tell them that I haven't done this in ages. Like, I think the honesty in that moment, as opposed to like me acting like I know I'm like cool with this and like, yeah, nah, let's go. Let's do this. Like, instead of that.
That's pretty sexy. That is pretty sexy.
Instead of that kind of like energy and that approach, which kind of like it's not you. So you get trapped in like, I was going to say positions. That's not what I meant. You get trapped in situations that aren't you, and you try and get out of it in a weird way. It ends badly. Whereas if you
honesty and vulnerability,
if you're honest about your fear, and I just feel like that's, I don't know, if it was with a man or a woman, I just feel like that's so much more attractive, and I think everyone feels a lot more safer, and I think that I just feel like I wish I had have been like that.
Yeah, two things that I'm kind of, I guess, really picking up on what you just said is, first one, I think that's a really good example of how this kind of like grape culture, I call it a lot in the book, impacts men and sets expectations for them as well. So like this idea that like, maybe you said you didn't really have any interest in having, sorry, I don't want to like analyze you.
Please.
You said you didn't have like any interest in having one night stands, yet that was like expected of you to do that. And then when you're in that position, this idea of like confidence and like knowing what to do, that is underpinned by a very strong societal narrative that sex or intimacy is like a script, but that is not actual intimacy. Intimacy would be honesty and vulnerability, and you couldn't actually do anything wrong or there's nothing to be scared of in a situation if you're taking it moment by moment with a person and vibing off each other's energy and having open communication in that situation. And if you are doing that and you're being empathetic, you're being honest, you're being vulnerable, it's almost impossible to violate someone's consent. So you don't even need to think about that stuff if that was inherent in boys and men to kind of exhibit those traits. Sorry, I think it is inherent in them. I think it's kind of taken out of a lot of boys and men. And I think it's not celebrated as much as it should be.
Which is kind of the opposite of going back to like films and TV. Like and I go back to thinking about like when I was single for the first time and out there in the wild, and I was visualizing, okay, what does a one night stand look like? Because that's what I'm going into.
I'll do that script.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Well, it means that you're performing, right? That's not authentic.
Totally. And the one night stands that I could picture, there's no talking.
No.
In films and stuff, it's just like this, it's ravenous, like throwing clothes off.
Yeah, exactly.
And just like getting thrown on the bed and just like passion like you can't believe and extreme confidence. And so I was like, okay, well, that's what I've got to, that's what it looks like.
You're so good at talking. That's such a like.
But that's not, but I feel like
a real strength of yours. Having not made one for you, I don't know what your other strengths are, but talking is definitely a strength.
Josh, it's just season 5. Give it time. But I think like that, the image I had of a successful, quote unquote, successful one night stand was that where there is no talking. It's like passion. There's, there's like looks and like close ups and, like it's not said with words, it's said with actions. And that is what I was probably trying to emulate terribly, because not only is that not me, but also it's like that is not a way to create a safe environment, to have zero talking. Like it sounds bizarre saying
and it's also just not how, like, I mean, we all know how fake movies are. Like sex scenes in movies are absolute, like just, I don't know where they got that from.
Well, I think I know that now, but I think it took me a long time to know that, because I was in a relationship for such a long time. So I didn't know what the real world was actually like outside of film and television.
Well, I think the real world is like the real connection you would have had with those people. And like, I mean, obviously you can have real connections with someone no matter how long you've known them. But I guess it comes down to this idea that, if you're scared of not being able to meet some sort of expectation, that means that you're trying to perform. And when that's the case, in that moment, you've kind of stripped the interaction of all forms of intimacy and like true human connection.
Yeah.
So it shouldn't be, I don't know. It's interesting because I've like never been scared of having any sort of like sexual intimacy of like, I can't, like nothing can be awkward for me in those moments, because as long as it's like nothing more vulnerable you can do with someone, I think. So why would like communication not flow easily with that?
It makes so much sense when you say it. Like it makes so much sense, but
But it's certainly not the message you get growing up. Like that makes, I wish someone had told me that when I was 13 when about to embark on the confusing world of being a teenager, because I feel like the leaning into the vulnerability and being honest about the vulnerability and how terrifying and all that kind of stuff is the answer, as opposed to the covering up and the performance. That, you said it better then, but it's just such a beautiful reframing. And it also strikes me that I don't really know what, like I think I have an idea of what good sex education would be, but I think because like I don't know what, and the fact that there's so much porn and so much bad representations in films, and I'm sure there are many, many exceptional people like yourself trying to get better sex education into curriculums and to kids, but I certainly have no experience of it when I was a kid. And so I guess the question is, what does it look like? What is good sex education for children?
Yeah, it's a big it's a big question, even though it's obviously like bread and butter as well. I think one thing as well I want to point out before going into this is that I think we've spoken a lot about teenagers in this conversation, but it definitely, I think it's relevant to men like throughout their lives. And I think especially early 20s as well, when you're kind of like at uni, maybe college, like these things can also like come out to play quite a lot. I focus a lot on teenage years because that's when we have the infrastructure to be able to educate like whole generations of people. So it's kind of tricky because I actually don't think the education system alone, A, is able to, or B, is appropriate to deliver full sexual education the way that I think young people need it. What we have now in Australia, which I'm very proud of and like very happy with, is consent education being built on from kindergarten until year 10 in an age-appropriate way and in a holistic way. So age-appropriate means in kindergarten it's, can I play with your toys? Can I braid your hair? Saying yes and no.
The teeny tiny Stevies singing I'm the boss of my body, which is like our kids are obsessed with that song. They use it in the wrong time all the time. It's like, I go, can you go to bed? Oh, yeah, no, I'm the boss of my body. It's about consent, not about bedtime. But
well, yeah, that sort of stuff. Yeah, exactly. Like it's not in a sexual way. It is about teaching them about their own body. Very importantly in those younger years is teaching how to deny permission and teaching how to accept rejection and how to accept.
Sorry, is this your curriculum that you've developed? Is this what you're talking about?
So this is currently what's in the Australian curriculum. Yeah, I helped consult on developing it. Yep. It was consulted by like lots and lots of experts, and it wasn't. I didn't just make it up. It was but that's kind of like from a young age, building on that, bringing in holistic measures, understanding, these stereotypes that exist around us. Like, for example, in year 5, they might do an exercise where they say, what do we think of pink jobs? What do we think of blue jobs? And let's actually talk about how there are no pink jobs and no blue jobs, and that women can be doctors and men can be teachers or whatever, and breaking down those sort of stereotypes. And then when sex education comes in and you bring in consent in an explicitly sexual way, it just kind of like makes sense and clicks. But I don't think that is enough, even though I think it's great. I think that we do have to be wary of the fact that a lot of sexual violence for young people often comes from their teachers, unfortunately. So we can't kind of blur those lines too much about what teachers can speak to students about, because we don't want it to like lend itself to any form of like inappropriate relationships or conversations, I think. But I still think that that's when parents really need to step up, and again, like media and what we consume and like what we talk about, where we need to have much more explicit conversations about sexual pleasure, true desires, kind of like understanding expectations. I think that we need to have more conversations about like body image issues that come from either, being in these situations or seeing porn that is depicting these situations occur in a very specific way with a very specific body type. And I think that I find it really weird that we do talk about sex as a society. Like, it is a topic of conversation a lot, but we just like kind of talk about the wrong aspects of it. Like, why aren't we getting into the nitty gritty of kind of like how it's supposed to be exhibited, what it looks like? So like in Sex Education, that show that came out this year, the new season, they have things like they have someone in a bathroom saying, "Can I take your top off? Can I kiss you? Can I touch you here?" And it's just so simple. And that is actually exactly how it goes. And I think those conversations need to be explicitly said in classrooms to give children like language to be able to use.
Yeah.
You do make a good point. My head's going to just like how you best communicate this in the most, like, what is the way, where will kids be most, and I say kids meaning teenagers, but where will they be most likely to take that on and get through to them? And I'm thinking, I think it's media. I do think
cultural.
media, sorry, I'm just workshopping a campaign in my head here, but like, which is what you do for a living. But
I think you're right. I think it probably does, as far as speaking to young boys, it probably does require like someone to endorse it, like some huge, messy, like.
I think a lot, the problem with that is that, I don't mean this in an attacking way to boys and men, but because of the rates that people experience sexual violence of both women and men, almost all of the time, 97% of the time, that's perpetrated by a man. A lot of the time when like male ambassadors have come on for things like this, it's been a PR disaster because it's only a statistical, like there's only a certain amount of men you can have on board before statistically one of them has done something that someone's willing to talk about.
Yeah.
So it's like, which is so hard. And I think also puts a lot of fear around men having these sort of conversations or trying to be ambassadors for them. Maybe not, publicly, like maybe they're not messy, but even, in their schools or like amongst their friend groups or whatever, because they're worried that someone's going to be like, hey, no, you can't talk about that because you did this. Yeah. And it doesn't kind of leave room for self-accountability and growth and doing better, which I'm very pro, the fact that we should be able to say, take a moment, reflect, think about what's been wrong with past behaviours and be willing to do better going forward and how we can actually focus on that future.
Yeah, because if there's no opportunity for growth, there's no opportunity for change.
Exactly. And I mean, it is so hard because, there is a part of me like, I live and breathe this. I spend like a day hasn't gone by in the last 3 years that a woman or a man hasn't told me about them being sexually assaulted or raped. That's just like my day-to-day life. So it is very hard to not be very angry and very frustrated. But there's going to be no change if we have so much shame around this topic. I think there really needs to be space there. Public scale can be quite different, but again, in that kind of like personal safe space amongst families, amongst friends, how we can like all commit to doing better.
Have you, in the time that you've been dedicating your life to this, have you seen change or have you seen conversations change in any ways?
It's tough. Over the last few years, I've definitely seen it be more common in movies to like exhibit things like consent, like even Heartbreak High and stuff like that. And it's hard to know if I live in like an echo chamber or not. It does feel like younger people are getting better at this sort of stuff. Like, I don't know, I spoke to my younger cousin like last year and he was just so well versed in all of this stuff, and it made me very happy. I was kind of not expecting that. But then I go into a school and I deliver a consent ed talk, and every time I see girls have the same realization that I had when I had my consent education talk, and it makes it feel very much like an uphill battle, which I think is, again, so key to why we need men involved in this conversation so much, because it is such a emotional toll. There's so much emotional labor that goes into these conversations. I know it's my job, so it's different, but for a lot of people who have been victims of this sort of abuse to have to consistently educate and explain these things to the people around them, it's quite...
That's asking a lot.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people do it, but it would be much better if people who didn't have kind of personal or loaded feelings attached to these topics to be willing to do it themselves as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And take off that burden.
Yeah.
To kind of reiterate the feeling that you are rightly optimistic about this, I do feel like we are very much, and I'm saying we, maybe human beings, but I guess more specifically to me, boys and men, a product of our environment and the product of the people around us and the company that we keep. I had this year level at my school. It was a private school. The year level I was in, it was there was none of this stuff. It was the most, I think it's very much an anomaly.
You mean none of the education? Or none of
No, I mean none of the sexual harassment and that, none of that blokey one up and that wasn't the currency. Sorry, I'll correct myself there. Saying that for the entire level is a huge, I don't know for sure. Let me rephrase it by saying in my friendship group, to my knowledge, there was just none of this type of behaviour. And I remember other levels used to laugh at us and in a very, put us down a lot because we weren't like that at all. To the point of, I don't know if we'll put this in, but just to give you an example, when I was in year 12 at a party, and so I was 17, very, very nearly 18, and I'd hooked up with a girl, and nothing that mum and dad are listening, and she was wanting to have sex, and I remember saying to her, "No, I'm actually waiting till I'm in love." And that was as a 17-year-old boy.
Yeah.
But that's because that was the way my mates were. Everyone was all the boys that I went to in my year level were like that. They're like, that's just the way.
Or in your friendship group.
Sorry.
Yeah, you should probably.
And so I do think if you create a culture amongst a group of boys where it's in other year levels around us, it wasn't like that at all. And we were very aware of that. And you could find yourself, when you were hanging out with the other year levels, you would feel yourself sort of putting on a bit of an act a bit more. But in that group of people that I was with, so my point is, if you can create a culture with a confident group of young men who are confident to say that kind of stuff, it will shift very quickly.
Very quickly.
Because that's all I knew. And then when I left school and went to sporting clubs, I reckon I changed as my company changed. The people I was with, I would say I became more willing to laugh at that kind of stuff. I was involved in jokes around that kind of stuff. I heard conversations, or there were things happening on sporting trips that I was like, that's not okay, but you'd sort of just let it go and not say anything. So I do think you are very much a product of the company that you keep and the culture that's in your circle. And so the work
and the influences within that group.
Yeah, the people I really cared about, their opinions and the people that I loved, that influenced who I was in a very big way. And so that's why I think the work that you do in trying to create these good cultures it's unbelievable.
Well, I think, again, on this cultural idea, and just to show how easy that switch can occur, but then also how mammoth the problem is. Actually, this is a quote from the book that I remember really liking, but basically said, as soon as it's more socially acceptable to call out an act that is rape culture, to call out someone catcalling someone at the bus stop and be like, oh, hey, mate, that's not very nice, than it is to do that act that enables rape culture, then the whole structures rape culture will fall into generation.
Yeah.
As soon as it's more normal to be like, oi mate, no. And right now it is more normal to actually do that thing than it is to say, oi mate, no, because we all know what it's felt like to be a bystander and want to say something and not say something and go home and feel so bad about it.
Yeah. So I'm happy you brought that up, because that's actually something really fascinating me with the book, because some people might be going, what, catcalling someone, that's not that bad. That's something like that. That's just a joke amongst people. Someone get over that very quickly. But you presented in your book something called the rape culture pyramid. Well, it says here, tolerance of the behaviours at the bottom supports or excuses those higher up. So it's at the bottom of the pyramid, it's Sorry, I should get you to explain.
No,
this.
you please, you do.
Okay.
Yeah.
So at the bottom of the pyramid, you've got things like sexist attitudes, rape jokes, locker room banter. And then as you go up a line, it's like catcalling, unwanted non-sexual touch, stalking. Upper level goes flashing and exposing, unsolicited nude pics. Upper level goes groping, non-consensual photo or video. And it just goes all the way up. And to the very point end of the triangle or the pyramid, there's rape. And when you look at it like that, you can just see how it's like, it's not a huge jump up to the next level. And so you can see how that happens. But also, to back up your point there, if you remove the bottom couple of layers of that pyramid, it is a huge jump to get to flashing and exposing, unsolicited nude pics. So what you said then is so very powerful, and it really puts the onus on all of us, even the smallest inappropriate comment or joke or catcall, to call it out straight away. And this is why, like the comment I wrote on your book was, this has the power to change the world. And that's that's the feeling I had, but actually looking at that pyramid and the way you've explained that, that's how this book can change. When people read this book, boys read this book, women read this book, of all ages, it'll change the world. And I think that pyramid is one of the reasons why.
Yeah, thank you again for a very kind endorsement. But I also think it's going to be quite hard to articulate just by speaking right now, but I think the book kind of addresses it consistently and a lot, is also this idea of how a very like gendered hierarchy is consistently being reinforced through these sort of day-to-day acts, and how that idea of women being subordinate to men in a lot of these situations can contribute to, that entitlement to their bodies, and can contribute to the way that women respond to acts of sexual assault or sexual violence and things like that. And something as, obviously I don't think it's small, but as small as a catcall, I understand how easily that can be done, especially when you're with your mates and it's funny and you want to one up the person and what they said to someone else last week. Something like that reinforces this idea that men have entitlement to yell at you in the middle of the street while you're going about your day. There's nothing you can do about it because they're bigger than you and stronger than you. And if you turn around and try to say something to a group of 5 men, you have no idea what's going to happen to you. That also consistently is like a very strong foundation of rape culture. So even these like jokes, the banter, the whatever, is still very fundamental in the day-to-day experience of everyone.
Totally.
Hugh in the intro said I can't remember the exact phrasing, but he said something about the courage. I don't know how you find the courage, and then I think you corrected and said, I don't know if that's the right word, to do what you do. How do you define it? Do you see it as courage, or do you, and where does where did the drive, I mean, it sounds like an obvious question, but you also then said that you were guilty of, just like all of us, of laughing at it or making inappropriate jokes. And in the past, where did the switch happen, or the drive, and then where does the drive come from, and do you define it as courage? It's like a big question.
Big questions. The switch, I think, happened kind of as soon as I started learning about this stuff. I had this good friend, Grace, at school, and a lot of my feminism came from her. She kind of I remember she was the first person to tell us not to use the word slut, and kind of, she was the one who would lead the boycott against the boys when I can't even remember what they did, but something horrible, I'm sure. And I think that, I feel like for me, as soon as I've ever been educated even a little bit on this stuff, I personally have been quite responsive to it. And it's kind of just this big light bulb moment around it. On the topic of courage, I find that really interesting because I'm very consistently called brave. And I think it's really funny because I think I'm the least brave person in the world. I hate challenging myself. I don't like it.
Interesting career choice.
Yeah. Well, I guess my idea of bravery and challenging is always from a physical sense, and I'm very I'm never going to run a marathon in my life. I never want to do a big leap over something like that. I went to this treetops thing on the weekend. Have you guys ever been to a treetops?
Oh yes, the obstacle course, but in the trees.
It was literally my worst nightmare. And I feel that's brave. You're hanging on a harness,
leap over something,
and you're exactly.
I've done the treetops course, and I reckon you're braver than me. And I was
Did
good
you
at
do
it.
the black run though? Because it was really hard.
Yeah, Chanel. I
Okay,
did.
all right. Well, I think it's all upper body strength, which I do not have.
Have you ever leapt over something though?
No. I wouldn't dare.
You are not brave.
Anyway, so the bravery thing, it's really interesting to me because, I don't think of myself as brave at all, but I'm very consistently told that I'm brave, which is quite shocking, or like courageous, like these sort of words. But I think it just speaks to the whole problem we have that, like, the time I got called most brave is when I went public with my story of sexual assault. And I think that speaks more than anything to how society treats its victims of sexual violence. When speaking up about it is deemed and understood as brave by so many people, like quite universally.
Yeah.
But no, I don't think it's brave. I think of it as almost like a duty. It's like I have this incredible platform now. And even though, I mean, speaking about being vulnerable, even though it's like absolutely exhausting and it has impacted my life in incredible ways and I feel so unbelievably privileged, but it has also had like very like drastically bad impacts on my life in terms of my relationship with men, with sex, with myself, all these different things. It feels as though there are these human rights violations going on in mass in Australia, and I feel as though they're preventable, so I'm obviously going to try and do something about it, and I expect the same of everyone else.
Yeah, beautifully said.
How are you right now, having your books out there now, and what you just said then, like what you're doing has had a negative impact on you. What about right now? And if you don't mind me asking, the book's out, and it's like the feeling of knowing that people can read your work and know more about you. How are you going now?
No, it feels quite nice actually. I mean, it was quite scary on like actual publication day, thinking this is out there. There's nothing that can be done now. But I mean, I'm sure I'm going to grow as a person. I'm sure I'm going to regret things I said. I'm sure I'm going to learn more and change my mind on things. But that's like me and what I think and what I know now. And I feel like quite proud of that to be out there. But I'm like unbelievably exhausted at the moment just because I don't know, I used to think it didn't bother me as much, but I feel like I almost had like a wall up, but it just does like it also even means that like when I'm at social events, people almost always speak to me about these sort of topics. So it's like almost impossible to not like to go like 4 hours without having a conversation about sexual violence. And then also in my own head, it's impossible to go like 10 minutes without thinking about, that's probably a stretch even, about these sort of things. And yeah, that just like, I guess does slowly get to you.
And with the messages, people reaching out to you to share their stories, that must take a toll as well.
Yeah, massively. And it's really hard because I obviously really want to reply and like be there and be supportive. But I've also learned that me replying to one person's message is not going to do anything. If I can kind of like preserve myself and keep using my platform to like work towards these more structural things, that will hopefully do a lot more.
You've only got so much time and energy at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So you've got to focus it.
Yeah, God, I feel like I just complained. I'm not complaining. It's obviously like the most
that's-
exciting thing ever. And I feel so thankful for these opportunities. And I've had also like the best time, like going on my book tour was like the best 2 weeks of my life. Like it was just absolutely incredible to meet those people, to have those conversations, to, you know, feel as though hear all the feedback from people and all of that sort of stuff. But yeah, I guess that's always why it's nice when people are willing to come along and help with this journey, because the more people do, the less other people have to do.
Well, Chanel, thank you so much for joining us today. I know you haven't jumped over anything, but I think you are so unbelievably courageous.
I had to power walk here. My phone was out of battery. It's pretty courageous.
Pretty brave.
Yeah. sorry.
The book is Consent Laid Bare. And good luck with your Australian of the Year nomination.
And yours next year.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Nominate you right back.
We've just, I don't know, it just feels such a privilege to be chatting to you. And I feel, I don't know, when we meet people like Chanel, we just feel like the future of this country is in good hands. Mm-hmm. You know, when you meet young people who are, who are fighting the systems but being kind to people, I think it's incredible. So good luck with everything you're doing, and the world needs your work. And I said it during the interview, but I truly believe your book can change the world. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a privilege. And thank you everyone who listened, because I know it's not an easy thing to listen to the very end of a show like this, so thank you.
The Imperfects is hosted and produced by Hugh Van Cuylenberg, Ryan Shelton and Josh Van Cuylenberg. Our executive producer is Bridget Northeast. This episode is filmed by Andy Poole and edited by George Martin. The Imperfects is not a licensed mental health service and is not a substitute for professional mental health advice, treatment or assessment. The advice given in this episode is general in nature, but if you're struggling, please see a healthcare professional or call Lifeline on 131114.